and the members of her household were baptized, she invited us to her home. If you consider me a believer in the Lord, she said, come and stay at my home. And she persuaded us. I bet she said she had some fried chicken or something. That would persuade me too. But you think about this. They go into this city, and in order for a church to be established in a city in those days, you had to have 10 men of that faith that would establish a church. So at this point in Philippi, there was no Christian church, all right, because the Christian church was just being planted. And so Paul says, we're not going to skip church because there's not a church here. Let's find some believers. So they had heard there was a prayer meeting going on down by the river. So they go down there, and it's a group of ladies. Now, in our society, that doesn't mean anything. Back then, it meant something. It was very different. Men and women were not equal. But here's what I love is that Paul and the disciples that were traveling with him, they valued prayer over whatever society was saying. Mm-hmm. And so they sat down with them. At some point, Paul was asked to speak, or he spoke, and there was a lady there named Lydia. And it says that she was a dealer in purple cloth from the city of Thyatira. The city of Thyatira was about 300 miles away. Purple cloth, as you know, was something that was reserved for royalty. It was very exclusive. In our economy, 1 pound of this Tyrian dye would be $19,000. I mean, that's like a car, or a nice car. You know what I mean? Like, to have. So if you're just like having that kind of money, walking around money to put on clothes, it's going on, okay? Lydia was successful. She invites them to her home. Interesting thing, how many women in the Bible owned homes? Well, if you include Lydia, that would be 1, okay? So she's 300 miles from home, owns her own home, successful, and she says, come to my home and the people in her household. There's no mention of a father or a husband or a brother. This was a strong, successful, intelligent, probably single business lady who was there. And I love the words that it says. The English language doesn't do it very good, but it says she was a worshiper of God. Now, whenever you say that word worshiper in this way, you have to do like air quotes. She was a worshiper. In other words, I went to church. Okay? If she got in trouble, she'd throw a Hail Mary up. She'd say, God, if you just, if you'll just do it this one time, I will always, or she'll make, she was sensitive to a higher power, but she wasn't a believer. And the reason we know that is because that's exactly what that word worshiper means in this text. But then the next thing it says, and then she opened her heart, which literally means she opened her mind. She didn't make an emotional, crying, blubbering down the aisle. She made an intelligent, rational decision based on the facts and the truth that she heard. What a woman, right? Wouldn't you love to have met? I mean, I can't, she's one of the people I want to meet when I get, I got a list. I don't know, do you guys have a list? Like, if this is how it works in heaven, I'm not sure if it does, but I got a list of people I like, how did you walk on water? Like, what, but anyway, sorry, I digress. So she became a Christian. She believed. She invited them into her house. She made space for the disciples. Now that sounds pretty good, but let me tell you Lydia's impact as we move forward. If you look over in verse 40, okay, Paul and Silas had been teaching, and there was this young girl that was hanging around them, and she was actually possessed by a demon, and she would foretell the future. And the guys that owned her would charge people. So if you want to know your future, okay, but it's going to cost you $20, okay? Well, she kept hanging around them, and Paul and Silas cast the demon out, and these guys got mad because their cash cow was gone, and they were actually going to get a real job, And so they had them thrown in prison. They're in prison, an earthquake happens, and they escape from prison, and you know that story. But as soon as they get out of prison after this miraculous escape, verse 40, they're in a town of Philippi. Where do they think they should go? After Paul and Silas came out of prison, they went to Lydia's house, where they met with the brothers and encouraged them. Okay? Lydia's home, she invited them for dinner. It became a ministry center for the city of Philippi. And it didn't stop there. Do you know how I know that? 2 reasons. First of all, have you ever heard of the book of Philippians? It was written to the church in Philippi. Who do you think was one of the charter members of that church? Who do you think rounded up 10 guys so they could establish a church? Who do you think did that? Well, it was Lydia. The second reason I know it's true is because it's in the Bible. So, I'm kind of behind on slides here. Turn in your Bibles to 2 Corinthians chapter 8, and let's see the impact that Lydia had in this church. 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verses 1 through 5. This is Paul writing again, and he's writing to the church in Corinth, okay? But he's talking about this church in Philippi. And now, brothers, we want you to know about the grace that God has given the Macedonian churches. All right, that's where they were at. Verse 2. Out of the most severe trial, their overflowing joy, their extreme poverty welled up in rich generosity. For I testify that they gave as much as they were able, and even beyond their ability, entirely on their own. This is what gets me. I've never heard of another church like this. They urgently pleaded for us for the privilege of sharing in the service of the saints. And they did not do as we expected, but they gave themselves first to the Lord and then to us in keeping with the Lord's will. I mean, can you imagine if we were in church and we passed the offering tray and everybody goes, guys, I just didn't feel like we did good enough. Let's pass it again. Let's go around. And everybody's like, yeah! And the pastor falls over dead, right? Like it's never happened, right? You know? But who do you think helped get that core value in that church of generosity? Probably Lydia, because she was generous from the first part. Well, how do we know that? How do you know she was generous? Okay, Philippians chapter 1, verse 5. Okay, turn there. And I'm actually going to start in verse 4. And this is Paul again writing to the church in Philippi a few years later after they established the church. In all my prayers for all of you, I always pray with joy because of your partnership in the gospel from the first day until now. So Paul says the Philippian church has been a partner in the gospel. That's code. If you ever talk to a missionary or a minister, that's code for you've supported me financially. Like, thank you for being a partner. In other words, thank you for your money so my kids can eat, right? Kind of a thing. And so, who do you think influenced that church? It had to be Lydia. Philippians chapter 4, verse 15, just a couple pages over, says this. Moreover, as you Philippians know, in the early days of your acquaintance with the gospel, when I set out from Macedonia, not one church shared with me in the matter of giving and receiving, except you only. So here's a church that from day one of its core values was we are going to help support the cause of Christ. We are going to not just be satisfied that we have a nice little church here, but we're going to support other churches as they're being planted around the region. You know, one of the things I love about Southeast Christian Church is that since day one, that's been one of our values. In fact, we have a goal in another year that 25% of every dollar that's put in the offering plate will be given away. And our elders have designated different things. Like, let me give you an example. 2 years ago, they said we were raising it gradually, 1% a year. They were going to do 1% of our budget to help widows and orphans. You know, in James, it talks about pure religion is this, that you take care of the widows and orphans in their time of need. And they said, this seems to me like a biblical directive, so we're going to take 1% of our budget off the top and give it to widows and orphans. Now, we had already been at 20%, so we were raising it up. Our budget that year was $60 million. So what's 1%? $600,000. And you know what my first thought is, because I am not a widow or an orphan, man, we could use that money down here in E-Town. You know, we got some curbing that needs to replace over here, and I'd like to redo the carpet in the entryway. No, right? Our church is saying they're gonna give away more. This year, what we're trying to figure out is how can we help those people as we are kind of hopefully on the second half of COVID or the last tail. I'd like for it to be gone today, but anyway, you know, people coming out of it. There's going to be some serious needs. So what do we do with that money? How can we do that? So our church is emulating that. But see, the Philippian church did this? Where do you think they learned? It had to be from a woman that started the church with generosity, who was successful in the world's eyes, but didn't want to hold on to the world with one hand and God with the other hand. She wanted to bring it together and say, God, it's yours. And she impacted a church. She impacted a region. She also was the first convert in Europe that we read about in the Bible. Both sides of my family have come from Europe. So I don't know if this is true or not, but to me, I think I owe Lydia a bit of a debt that I'm here in Elizabethtown, Kentucky, because generation upon generation upon generation ago, she was living out her faith in a way. So God is calling us today, I believe, to be like Lydia, to create space, to use our giftedness. It may not be hospitality. Maybe you're cold and prickly and don't want anybody around you. But God has given you a gift. Maybe it's not generosity, okay? But maybe it's serving. Maybe it's leading. Maybe it's encouraging. Maybe it's teaching. Maybe it's whatever it is. God is calling us to do that, to make space in our life for that, and to be able to do that. So one thing that I love about Lydia was, as a new believer, she probably didn't know what to do. And so the first thing that popped to her mind was, you guys got to come to my house. She just used what she had. That's what I love. And so one of the questions is what do you have that you can use for God? Do you have a pickup truck? Do you have a computer? Do you have a skill? Do you have time that you could use for God? Okay, so we want to take a look at how we can be unleashed in the way that Lydia was unleashed. And so we're going to do that by looking at these three questions. Now, this is as big as I could get it, and I totally apologize because it looked much larger in my office than it does on the screen, okay? But the first question is, on a practical level, what does hospitality and generosity look like for you, okay? This may not be the gifts that you have, but just honestly, what's it look like for you? For Lydia, it was her leading gifts. The second question is, when Lydia opened her life and home to God, she found a place to belong. How have you seen this to be true in your own life, where you find a place to belong? And the third question is, the story of Lydia suggests that we may have to give up the pursuit of worldly success to find spiritual significance. What things keep you connected to a desire for personal success? Like, what keeps you tied in and say, no, I want to be a success? And what might you need to let go of to give yourself to Christ more fully? That's kind of the question, okay? So make sure you don't avoid that by talking about other stuff and running out of time, okay? You want to get there. If you guys want to take a picture of this with your cameras, because it's small, I know it is, but I want to send you guys off on that, okay? And table leaders, right afterwards, I just need you for just a few seconds, okay? So don't run away unless you have to, okay? All right, thanks, guys. Go.